It's OPB Politics Now for Friday, July 19th. Peter Courtney, the longest-serving state lawmaker in Oregon history and arguably the most consequential, died this week. He was a Salem legend. When Courtney was first elected some 40 years ago, Republican Vic Atiyeh was governor. Then he served under Neil Goldschmidt, Barbara Roberts, Ted Kulongoski, John Kitzhaber twice, and Kate Brown. And maybe those names are more familiar to most Oregonians, but he was a consistent force, an influential player in determining what policies made it into law and shaped our state. It was often Courtney who had the power over whether a legislative session was productive or fell into disarray. And then there was his style. As one reporter said decades ago, in the often drab world of state lawmaking, Courtney stood out in technicolor. He's hard to describe, really, but we're going to do our best. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Dirk, we learned this week that Peter Michael Coleman Courtney died of cancer. He was 81, and his death immediately led to a huge outpouring of appreciation for this person who was really a singular figure in state politics. Let's just start out with a reminder of his political career. It was long.
Yes, it was. As you said, Lauren, Peter Courtney spent more than 40 years in elected office over his life, nearly all of that in the legislature. He started in the 70s. He did a 6-year stint on the Salem City Council, moved up to the state house in 1980, and served there for a couple of years before he attempted to run for Congress in 84. That failed. Then he attempted to run at state senate. That failed. And we should say that anyone who talked to Courtney for any length of time probably heard about those failed races, since he seemed to dwell on them a bit. But he wound up going back to the state house, rising through the Democratic ranks there. He became House Minority Leader, jumped to the Senate in 99, and in just 4 years became the powerful Senate president, which is a role he held until he retired in 2022. So, Courtney was a mainstay in Salem just by virtue of how long he was around. But more than that, as you noted, he was a truly original character, which is one reason why his death got such a strong reaction this week.
And Senator Courtney was, of course, a Democrat. But for a long time, at least a decade that now Governor Tina Kotek was Speaker of the House, the more progressive Democrats in the House felt like he ran his chamber in just like an overly bipartisan fashion. He was often blamed when more progressive legislation came out of the House and then died in the Senate. At the same time, other people really praised him for trying to get buy-in from the minority party, for not steamrolling them. He said he once read in a newspaper that Speaker Kotek was trying to describe the dynamic, and here's how he put that in his own words.
Well, the Senate prioritizes getting along or trying to work with each other more than the House does. She said that. And when I read it, I just smiled and said, I suppose that's right.
He was just this type of politician who was really about governing. He was not about scoring political points. He was what some people might now consider sort of old school in his attempt to be bipartisan.
Yeah, I mean, in our obit of Courtney, we described him as a sort of last bastion of the Oregon way, which is that often idealized notion you hear about of these bygone days where lawmakers would put partisanship aside and govern for the greater good. Courtney really held on to that, and I think that's one reason why he commanded such influence. Actually, the year Courtney took hold of the Senate presidency, 2003, the Senate was evenly split between 15 Democrats and 15 Republicans. And he became the choice of both parties to take on this incredibly powerful role just because of that even-handedness you are talking about. He never relinquished that power, obviously, despite some of the angst from progressive Democrats. And I think that's because Courtney was seen as someone who wanted to be a Senate president for the whole institution of the Senate, not just Democrats. And so obviously it's no surprise that we got these really respectful tributes from people on both sides of the aisle this week. Lauren, you talked to Senator Tim Knopp and former Senator Lee Byer. That's a Republican and a Democrat. Both of them held him up as one of the greatest lawmakers in state history, if not the greatest. I chatted, meanwhile, with State Senator Fred Girod. He's a former Senate Republican leader, a friend of Courtney's. He made clear that his appreciation was based on more than just bipartisanship. He actually liked Courtney's trash talk.
You know how guys trash talk, and Peter and I trash talked, and but we enjoyed it. And it was part of the game that we played, and it was who could outdo each other, and I rather enjoyed it, and I think he did too.
I don't think anyone who knew Peter Courtney would deny his affinity for trash talk.
Something else that Peter Courtney really loved was Oregon, even though he didn't grow up here.
Right. Yeah. Courtney spent the entirety of his early life on the East Coast. He was born in Philadelphia, grew up in Rhode Island and West Virginia, West by God, Virginia, as he would always call it. And, he was raised in part by his grandmother down there. It's one reason why he'd speak with this sort of Southern twang on and off, kind of. Went to grad school and undergrad in Rhode Island, then got his law degree in Boston and came out to Oregon pretty much immediately after law school to work as a clerk on the Oregon Court of Appeals.
Yeah, that's right. So he flew out here. He didn't know much about the state. He took a bus from Portland to Salem. He ended up staying at the YMCA in downtown Salem, where now there's this adjacent apartment building for veterans named after him. And he often told the story of how he ended up in Oregon.
When you come to a place that you don't know a soul, it's a long way from anything you know. You didn't even know where the plane was going to land because you didn't know where Oregon was 2 weeks before you came. You even never heard of it. And you're coming from 3 time zones. And then you see this biggest ice cream cone you ever saw out one window, which was Mount Hood in the summer. And then you get here and live at the Y. You have no friends. You have nothing. And that probably has shaped me more than anything.
Yeah, that is one of the classic Peter Courtney stories. He would tell it all the time, would swear up and down that even though he, as a person with a master's degree and a law degree, had absolutely no idea where the state of Oregon was on a map before he came out here. That, by the way, was from an interview Courtney did with Daniel Bonham, who is now the Senate Republican leader for the podcast Main Street Politics. It was a really, really good interview, so I recommend it if people are interested.
So he moves out here. He obviously develops a deep love for Oregon. And as we've been saying, he was also very influential on a lot of policies here, too.
Yeah, really more policies than we could ever run down, but we can try to do a few. For one, there is this very well-known tale about how Courtney was touring the state hospital grounds one day, not long after he became Senate president. And in his telling, he came across this shack, this locked shack, had the staff go and get a key. They opened it up and they found the thousands of these copper urns that were urns where they kept the cremated remains of past patients who died at the hospital. And that became this very formative moment. Here is how he described it.
And those of us who were in there, nobody talked and nobody moved. And then we left. And I'll never forget it. The next day I walked in the Speaker, Karen Minnis' office, and I said, "That is not Oregon." She says, "You're right." And we pledged then, no matter how much it cost to build a new state hospital.
And Courtney wound up doing that. They tore down the old hospital. They built a new facility. They built this really nice memorial that contains those copper urns. And in fact, the Salem campus of the Oregon State Hospital was actually named for Courtney on Tuesday. Coincidentally, that is the same day he died, but that is a name dedication that had been in the works for years. Courtney, also did a lot to change and modernize the legislature. That includes fighting for annual sessions. He was a key component of this 2019 bill that created a new business tax and is pouring billions and billions of more dollars into K-12 schools. And very notably, he had this abiding passion for animals. That led to a lot of bills like banning puppy mills, banning greyhound racing, all sorts of bills over the years. But actually, probably my favorite Courtney anecdote I heard in the last week was from former state senator Ginny Burdick. She worked with Courtney for more than 2 decades, and she told me this story of how her daughter in 2016 found 2 stray kittens in a Salem park and was trying to convince her to keep them.
So my daughter went to Peter and told him the story about how she had these little kittens and she just didn't want to give them to a bad home. And next thing I knew, I was in Peter's office. How could you do this to your daughter? Your daughter is in tears over this. How could you be so mean to your... Anyway, I ended up with both kittens.
And actually, Burdick still has one of those cats to this day. It is a very, very emblematic Peter Courtney story.
Well, we have already sort of touched on this, but let's really dig into what made Senator Courtney stand out. It was his style, his personality. He just had a booming voice. He was a natural storyteller. He never relied on talking points, or rarely seemed to. He was just very authentic. He was dour but funny. He complimented you and insulted you kind of at the same time. He seemed humble and self-deprecating, while he also seemed to have a lot of confidence.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a hard thing to describe, frankly. He'd always refer to himself in the third person, right? Like Peter, Michael, Coleman, Courtney did this or thinks that. He would inject obscure sports metaphors in whenever possible. It was just not always clear or easy to know where a conversation with Courtney was heading. And actually, I talked to a former state senator, Senator Arnie Roblin, this week. His take on this is that Courtney was a master of having the conversation that he wanted to have, not necessarily the conversation you wanted to have, and using these odd sorts of diversions to get to a place where he wanted it to go to sort of make his point or win his argument. Fred Gerard, the guy who was talking about trash talk, told me that you really had to be on your A game with Courtney. You know, people who were easily intimidated had a really hard time with him. But the other thing that you touched on, Lauren, was just how dour, how self-deprecating he often was. He hated praise. He loved to focus on the negative. He had this really dramatic pessimism in his public persona, at least. Here's a snippet of an interview Courtney did with Think Out Loud in 2017 that I think is a very good example of this.
Words like enjoy and happiness, I don't believe in all that stuff. I don't relate to it. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it means. I'm a workhorse. That's all I know. Hook up the plow, put me out in the field. I'll keep pulling until I drop dead, and you can turn me into glue.
And, you know, obviously that is a very dramatic quote. What's remarkable about Peter Courtney is just how often that kind of thing would be stated. That wasn't just something he said once and you know, didn't say again. Like, that type of sentiment was omnipresent.
He was a workhorse, too. I think
Right.
One reason, though, why we're dedicating this entire podcast to him is because of the role that he really played in our state's history. He championed a lot of policies. He had a hand in almost all the important legislation that became law in the past 4 decades. But really, like, his biggest legacy might just be that he cared about Oregon and he cared about the legislature as an institution.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, he was truly famous in the Capitol for his love of the institution. And I think it was notable to see how Courtney reacted toward the end of his tenure to some of the changes in the dynamics of the legislature. I'm thinking specifically of the Republican walkouts, right, that began in 2019 that have sort of become regular facets of the landscape ever since. Courtney really, you know, hated that. Not just that Republicans were walking away and making it so the Senate couldn't do business, but that they felt that they had to because they thought Democrats, his party, was being so unfair. That just is not the way he played the game. I think he saw it as this diminishment of what had been great about Oregon. Here is some of what he told Bonham for that podcast interview.
I'll just say that Oregon has become just another state, and I really regret that. And that is a tragedy for Oregon. Oregon, as I said, loves to be first or only. But today, Oregon is just another state. And the responses coming from elected officials are often from people from out of state. They brought their out of state here to Oregon versus they became organized, as I say. If you become organized, then you stop thinking about what is so precious and sacred about Oregon. So Oregon is just going the way that every other state's going now. The Civil War is here. I don't know where it ends.
And he is not saying organized there. He's saying organized. You know, you become influenced by the state and are changed by the state as opposed to changing it with your outside values, which is definitely the way Courtney considered himself.
Covering him as a reporter was kind of wild. I can like hear his voice in my head when he saw you, Dirk, and he would just shout out, Grand Rapids. Like, he liked to figure out where your hometown was or your school mascot and then would just kind of shout that at you. And you never really knew what kind of mood he would be in. I remember once he called me back at like 9:30 at night and just sort of started giving me his thoughts on watching The Crown. But he would almost always talk to us. Like he really believed in making himself available to the press. Like he felt like that was an important part of the whole institution.
Yeah, he was helpful. I mean, not always helpful, but willing to talk, I will say. It could be a wild ride interviewing him. He loves to badger reporters. I think this is part of the thing about keeping his interlocutors, the people he's talking to, on their heels a little bit by, out of nowhere he knows where you went to school or what their football team did this year or whatever. He would often accuse you of asking unfair questions or not getting to the point or whatever. I mean, I was actually trying to dig through and get an example of this, and I found this almost right away in some of our tape from 2019. So here's just an example of how he'd talk in interviews.
This is gotcha media, and it's a new phrase. It never used to be. I used to hold press conferences and have a blast, the battle between us. Now it's all gotcha. It's all clip art. What is it, clip art? Clickbait.
So it was combative sometimes, but it was never uninteresting. And I will just say this, it wouldn't be such a bad thing, in my opinion, for lawmakers these days who are still around to take Courtney's example a little more often.
Yeah, he was real. He was not afraid to say what he was actually thinking.
Right.
In his final years, he sort of got pushed out by a younger, more progressive faction of his caucus. I think his family was also worried about his health. But he made it clear that he really did not want to retire, and he only did so reluctantly. Here's what he said about it at the time, and I'm just going to let the senator have the final word.
I guess to everything, there's a beginning, there's a tweener, and there's an end. So I don't know what to do, but say, I guess I'll mosey. I get on my Palomino, and I'll mosey into the sunset.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We will be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, thank you for your support and thank you for listening.